The most terrifying thing about Big Brother is not that he takes away freedom. It's that, under the right circumstances, many people would willingly hand it over. That sounds absurd at first. After all, when people talk about George Orwell's 1984, they usually focus on surveillance, censorship, and authoritarian power. They see Big Brother as the villain, the obvious enemy, the face of oppression. But what if that interpretation is only scratching the surface? What if the real warning of 1984 is not about a dictator forcing his will onto society, but about a society becoming so afraid of uncertainty that it begins to desire control? Because that raises a much more uncomfortable question. Why do systems like Big Brother exist in the first place? Not how they maintain power. Not how they punish dissent. But why ordinary people allow them to emerge. And that question becomes even more disturbing when we stop thinking about 1984 as a fictional world and start thinking about human nature itself. Every civilization faces the same dilemma. Freedom creates possibilities. But freedom also creates unpredictability. It creates disagreement, conflict, risk, and uncertainty. People celebrate freedom when life feels stable. But what happens when stability begins to crack? What happens when fear starts spreading faster than trust? What happens when chaos feels closer than certainty? This is where Orwell introduces something far more dangerous than a political system. He introduces a psychological temptation. The temptation to trade responsibility for security. The temptation to exchange uncertainty for order. The temptation to let someone else decide what is true. And suddenly Big Brother stops looking like a monster from a distant dystopia. He starts looking like the answer to a problem people desperately want solved. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. We assume tyranny is built by people who love power. But what if tyranny often succeeds because people fear disorder even more than they value freedom? Think about the most famous image associated with 1984, a giant face staring from a screen. Big Brother is watching you. Most people interpret that image as surveillance. But look closer. The real power of the image is not that the screen is watching. The real power is that people begin acting as if they are being watched all the time. The prison moves from the outside world into the human mind. And once that happens, force becomes less necessary. Control becomes self-sustaining. That is what makes Big Brother such a fascinating entity. He is not merely a ruler. He is a symbol. A symbol of a system that promises protection while quietly reshaping the boundaries of thought itself. But here is the mystery that makes Orwell's warning endure decades after the book was written. What if Big Brother correctly identified a genuine human weakness? What if he understood that most people are not primarily afraid of oppression? What if they are more afraid of uncertainty? Because if that is true, then the story is no longer asking whether a dictator can seize power. It is asking something much larger. Under enough pressure, under enough fear, under enough instability, how many people would voluntarily help build the system that eventually controls them? And if that possibility exists, then perhaps the most important question in 1984 is not who Big Brother is. It is why people need him. If fear creates the demand for control, then a deeper question emerges. What exactly is being controlled? Most people assume the answer is behavior. Laws. Actions. Public speech. The visible things. But the architecture behind Big Brother's system points somewhere else entirely. The ultimate goal is not controlling what people do. It is controlling how they interpret reality. And that distinction changes everything. Because behavior can be forced. Reality cannot. At least, not directly. A government can tell people where to stand, what forms to fill out, or which rules to follow. But how do you control the private conversation happening inside someone's mind? How do you influence the invisible space where memory, judgment, doubt, and meaning are formed? That is the challenge every system of power eventually encounters. And it is here that one of the most powerful symbols in the story begins to reveal its true significance. The Ministry of Truth. At first glance, the name feels ironic. Almost absurd. But beneath the irony lies a profound insight about power itself. Power does not become truly stable when it controls people. Power becomes stable when it controls the framework through which people understand events. That is a very different level of influence. Because once a person loses confidence in their own perception, they become dependent on external authority to tell them what is real. And that creates a dangerous contradiction. The more uncertain reality becomes, the more valuable certainty appears. The more confusing the world feels, the more attractive simple answers become. The more information people encounter, the more they crave someone to organize it for them. Notice what happens here. What begins as a search for clarity slowly transforms into a surrender of judgment. And that transformation rarely feels dramatic. It feels comfortable. That may be the most unsettling revelation so far. People often imagine freedom being taken away through force. But some of the most important freedoms disappear through convenience. A little less uncertainty. A little less responsibility. A little less need to think critically. Each step feels small. Each step feels reasonable. Until one day the boundaries of acceptable thought have quietly narrowed. This is why another memory fragment matters so much, newspeak. Many people view it as merely a fictional language. But as a symbol, it points toward something much larger. Language is not just a tool for communication. Language is a tool for perception. The words available to us influence the ideas we can easily express, challenge, or even imagine. When vocabulary shrinks, possibilities shrink with it. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But gradually. And gradual change is precisely what makes it difficult to detect. This brings us back to Winston. His role is often misunderstood. He is not important because he is powerful. He is important because he represents something increasingly fragile, the ability to trust one's own memory. That sounds simple. Until you realize that memory is the foundation of identity. If the past becomes uncertain, then judgment becomes uncertain. If judgment becomes uncertain, then independence becomes uncertain. And if independence becomes uncertain, the individual becomes easier to shape. What makes this conflict fascinating is that neither side is motivated by the same goal. Winston represents the preservation of human complexity. Big Brother's system represents the elimination of uncertainty. One protects ambiguity. The other promises certainty. And for many people, certainty feels safer. But here is the mystery that remains unresolved. What if the greatest threat to freedom is not fear itself? What if the real danger begins when people become exhausted by complexity and start longing for a version of reality that is simpler, cleaner, and easier to accept? Because if that is true, then the struggle is no longer between citizens and rulers. It becomes a struggle between two competing desires inside every human mind. If the struggle is happening inside every human mind, then the conflict becomes far more complicated than a simple battle between freedom and control. Because the desire for freedom and the desire for certainty are not opposites. They often coexist inside the same person. And that is where the real crisis begins. Most people assume that oppressive systems are built by people who reject freedom. But what if the opposite is sometimes true? What if societies that value freedom can still create conditions that gradually undermine it, not because they hate liberty, but because they become overwhelmed by the responsibilities that liberty demands? This is where the role of O'Brien becomes fascinating. Not as an individual. Not as a character in a plot. But as a symbol of a deeper intellectual temptation. O'Brien represents the voice that says complexity is exhausting. Ambiguity is inefficient. Contradiction is dangerous. And uncertainty is a problem that should be solved. At first, that sounds reasonable. After all, who does not want clarity? Who does not want stability? Who does not want a society that functions smoothly? But hidden inside that promise is a contradiction that grows more dangerous with every step. The pursuit of absolute certainty eventually requires the elimination of competing perspectives. And once competing perspectives become unacceptable, disagreement begins to look like a threat rather than a normal part of human existence. This is where the scale of the conflict expands. What begins as a psychological preference becomes a political force. What begins as discomfort with uncertainty becomes a demand for conformity. What begins inside individual mind starts reshaping institutions, culture, language, and eventually reality itself. Notice how subtle this transformation is. No civilization wakes up one morning and announces that it has abandoned complexity. Instead, complexity is gradually replaced by simplification. Difficult questions are replaced by easy answers. Nuance is replaced by certainty. Inquiry is replaced by affirmation. And people often welcome the change because it reduces anxiety. That is why another memory fragment matters so much, the shrinking language of newspeak. Its true significance is not censorship. Its significance is compression. A civilization begins to lose something profound when its vocabulary for complexity starts disappearing. Because every lost distinction narrows the space in which thought can move. Every removed possibility makes reality feel smaller. And smaller realities are easier to manage. But they are also easier to control. This creates a paradox that sits at the center of the entire system. The system promises safety by reducing uncertainty. Yet uncertainty is one of the conditions that makes genuine freedom possible. Without uncertainty, there is no exploration. Without exploration, there is no discovery. Without discovery, there is no meaningful choice. And without meaningful choice, freedom becomes little more than a symbol. This is why Winston's role becomes increasingly important as the conflict deepens. He represents something more fragile than rebellion. He represents friction. The friction created when an individual refuses to fully surrender the ability to question. Not because he possesses extraordinary power, but because he preserves something the system finds difficult to tolerate, unresolved doubt. And doubt is dangerous. Not because it destroys societies, but because it prevents certainty from becoming absolute. The deeper contradiction begins to emerge here. Every stable system requires a degree of trust. But every free society requires a degree of doubt. Too much doubt creates fragmentation. Too much certainty creates stagnation. So where is the balance? And who gets to decide when stability becomes more important than freedom? That question grows even darker when we look beyond politics and into human nature itself. Because perhaps the ultimate goal of power is not obedience. Perhaps the ultimate goal is making obedience feel natural. Making conformity feel voluntary. Making alternatives feel unnecessary. And if that happens, something extraordinary occurs. People no longer need to be monitored constantly. They begin monitoring themselves. The giant screen that once symbolized external control becomes something far more powerful, an internal voice that quietly defines the boundaries of acceptable thought. Which raises a disturbing possibility. What if the strongest systems are not the ones that force people to submit? What if the strongest systems are the ones that convince people submission was their own idea? And if that is true, then we have not yet reached the deepest layer of Orwell's warning. Because the next question is not how power controls society. The next question is why human beings become willing participants in their own psychological confinement. What if the ultimate purpose of power is not to control what people do, or even what they think, but to control what they believe is possible? That question takes us into the deepest layer of the system. Up to this point, we have explored fear, certainty, conformity, and the gradual narrowing of independent judgment. But those are not the destination. They are mechanisms. The revelation begins when we stop looking at the system as a machine of oppression and start seeing it as a machine of limitation. Because the most stable form of control is not built on force. It is built on imagination. More specifically, it is built on restricting imagination. Every civilization exists inside a mental map. People make choices based on what they think can happen, what they think cannot happen, and what they think is worth pursuing. Most forms of influence compete within that map. But the system represented by Big Brother seeks something far more ambitious. It seeks to redraw the map itself. This is why one symbol quietly becomes more important than surveillance screens, political slogans, or public rituals. It is the disappearance of alternatives. Not the destruction of alternatives. The disappearance of them from consciousness. There is a profound difference. When people actively resist an idea, the idea still exists. When people cannot even imagine the idea, resistance becomes infinitely harder. This is where the true significance of O'Brien emerges. His role is not merely to defend power. His role is to represent a worldview in which reality itself becomes subordinate to authority. That is a startling contradiction. Most systems claim authority because they understand reality. This system claims authority because it defines reality. The difference may sound subtle, but its consequences are enormous. One approach allows truth to exist independently of power. The other makes power the source of truth. Once that shift occurs, every institution changes. Every conversation changes. Every memory changes. The conflict is no longer about facts. It becomes a conflict about the framework through which facts are interpreted. This is where another memory fragment becomes impossible to ignore: the ministry of truth. Its enduring power as a symbol comes from a disturbing inversion. The institution responsible for defining truth gradually becomes more important than truth itself. And when that inversion takes hold, society enters unfamiliar territory. People stop asking whether something is true. They begin asking whether something is approved. That shift may be one of the most consequential transformations any civilization can experience. Because approval is social. Truth is independent. Approval changes with power. Truth does not. The long-term consequence is not merely political. It is existential. A culture that loses confidence in objective reality eventually loses confidence in its own ability to reason. A population that loses confidence in reasoning becomes increasingly dependent on external interpretation. And dependence creates vulnerability. Notice how far the scale has expanded. We are no longer talking about a single government, a single era, or even a single ideology. We are examining a recurring temptation within human civilization itself. The temptation to replace uncertainty with certainty. Complexity with simplicity. Discovery with instruction. Yet the deepest revelation may still be ahead of us. Because the system's greatest achievement is not that it persuades people to accept a manufactured reality. Its greatest achievement is that, over time, many people stop realizing that an alternative reality could ever have existed. And that raises a question capable of changing how we view everything that has come before. If power reaches its highest form not when it controls behavior, but when it controls the limits of imagination itself, then what is the one thing that remains beyond its reach? If there is one thing that remains beyond the reach of power, what is it? The answer is not freedom. Freedom can be restricted. It is not language. Language can be reshaped. It is not memory. Memory can be manipulated, distorted, or forgotten. The deepest revelation hidden inside this entire system is something far more fundamental. The ultimate conflict is not between the individual and authority. It is not between truth and deception. It is not even between freedom and control. The ultimate conflict is between reality and the human desire to escape reality. That is the layer many readers never fully explore. Because the system represented by Big Brother is often interpreted as an external threat. A government. An institution. A structure of power. But beneath those visible forms lies something much older and much more universal. The temptation to replace an uncomfortable reality with a comforting one. Suddenly every major symbol begins to align. The giant face staring from the wall. The shrinking language. The institution that manufactures truth. The constant pressure toward certainty. They are not isolated mechanisms. They are components of a single philosophical project. A project designed to eliminate the friction between reality and desire. This is why the system appears so powerful. It offers something that many people secretly want. Not merely safety. Not merely order. It offers relief. Relief from ambiguity. Relief from complexity. Relief from contradiction. Relief from the burden of confronting a reality that refuses to conform to personal wishes. And that is where the deepest contradiction finally reveals itself. The system promises psychological comfort by reducing contact with reality. Yet reality is the very thing human beings need in order to grow, adapt, learn, and remain fully human. In other words, the cure destroys the patient. This is why Winston matters. Not because he defeats power. Not because he changes history. His significance is symbolic. He represents the stubborn human capacity to seek reality even when reality is uncomfortable. His role is not rebellion. His role is remembrance. He embodies the idea that truth possesses value independent of convenience. And that idea becomes the greatest threat imaginable to a system built on managed perception. Consider one final memory fragment. A person standing alone, uncertain of what is true, yet refusing to surrender the question itself. That image may be more powerful than any political symbol in the story. Because it represents a principle older than governments and larger than ideologies. The willingness to remain in uncertainty rather than accept a comforting illusion. That is the hidden line running through the entire work. The conflict is not between strength and weakness. It is between authenticity and artificial certainty. Once this becomes visible, the role of Big Brother changes completely. The system is no longer merely a warning about authoritarian power. It becomes a warning about a recurring pattern in human civilization. Whenever uncertainty becomes painful enough, societies become vulnerable to narratives that promise absolute answers. Whenever complexity becomes exhausting enough, people become attracted to simplified realities. Whenever fear becomes intense enough, truth becomes negotiable. The consequence reaches far beyond a single society. It reaches into philosophy, culture, technology, education, media, and every institution responsible for shaping perception. The question is no longer how power maintains itself. The deeper question is why reality itself becomes increasingly difficult for human beings to tolerate. And if the greatest danger is not the loss of freedom but the gradual abandonment of reality in exchange for comfort, then what kind of civilization emerges when entire generations begin preferring certainty over truth? If a civilization begins preferring certainty over truth, the consequences do not arrive all at once. They arrive quietly. That is the legacy hidden beneath everything we have explored so far. The greatest systems of influence rarely announce their victories. Instead, their success becomes visible through absence. The absence of curiosity. The absence of meaningful disagreement. The absence of independent judgment. The absence of people willing to endure uncertainty long enough to discover something new. This is the true cost left behind by the system. Not merely restricted freedom, but diminished human capacity. Because once reality becomes secondary to comfort, something fundamental begins to erode. The ability to confront complexity. The ability to revise beliefs. The ability to separate what feels true from what is true. And when those capacities weaken, the consequences spread far beyond politics. They enter culture, education, relationships, institutions, even personal identity. Consider the image that has followed us throughout this journey, the ever-present screen. Earlier, it symbolized observation. Later, it symbolized self-monitoring. But now its meaning expands again. The screen becomes a mirror. A civilization eventually begins seeing itself through the expectations of the system surrounding it. People stop asking, "What do I believe?" and begin asking, "What am I expected to believe?" That shift may appear subtle, yet it transforms entire societies. Because authentic thought requires internal reference points. Once those reference points disappear, identity becomes increasingly dependent on external validation. The long-term consequence is not obedience. It is dependency. This is where the legacy of Winston becomes more significant than his immediate role. He represents something many civilizations eventually struggle to preserve: intellectual independence. Not certainty. Not perfection. Independence. The willingness to remain engaged with reality even when reality is uncomfortable, incomplete, or unresolved. His symbolic value survives because he embodies a question rather than an answer. And questions often outlive systems. O'Brien leaves behind a different legacy. He demonstrates how intelligence can become detached from wisdom. His influence reveals that brilliant reasoning can be used to justify almost anything once truth becomes subordinate to objectives. That lesson extends far beyond a single story. History repeatedly shows that human beings are capable of constructing remarkably sophisticated explanations for beliefs they already want to hold. Which leads to another consequence that is rarely discussed. The danger is not only that powerful institutions shape perception. The danger is that ordinary people gradually learn to participate in that process themselves. The boundary between controller and controlled becomes less clear. The boundary between manipulation and self-deception becomes less clear. And eventually the system no longer survives because it is imposed. It survives because it is reproduced. Generation after generation. Assumption after assumption. Convenience after convenience. Now the scale expands one final time. We are no longer looking at a fictional society. We are looking at a recurring human pattern. Every civilization develops narratives that help people make sense of reality. Some narratives encourage exploration. Others encourage conformity. Some strengthen the capacity to question. Others weaken it. The tension between those forces never fully disappears. That is why the story continues to matter. Not because it predicts a specific future, but because it reveals a permanent vulnerability within human nature. A vulnerability that exists whenever comfort becomes more attractive than truth, whenever certainty becomes more attractive than inquiry, and whenever belonging becomes more attractive than independent judgment. Yet one mystery remains unresolved. If every generation faces this temptation in a different form, and if the desire for certainty is deeply rooted in human psychology, then is this struggle something humanity can ever permanently overcome, or is it a challenge that must be rediscovered and confronted again by every civilization that hopes to remain free? Perhaps the enduring power of this story has never come from its political warnings alone. Its lasting significance comes from something quieter, something more personal. It forces us to confront a possibility that many people would rather avoid. The possibility that the most important battles in human life are not fought in public squares, government buildings, or institutions of power. They are fought inside the invisible space where perception becomes belief, where belief becomes identity, and where identity begins shaping the world around us. That is why the symbols remain unforgettable long after the details fade. A face watching from a screen. A room associated with ultimate fear. A ministry devoted to defining reality. A language growing smaller year after year. These images endure because they are not merely parts of a fictional setting. They are reflections of recurring human tendencies. They point toward questions that never fully disappear. Questions about truth. Questions about courage. Questions about what it means to remain human when certainty becomes more attractive than understanding. In the end, the most important legacy does not belong to any single character. It belongs to the tension they collectively reveal. One figure represents the desire for order. Another represents the desire for truth. Another represents the desire for authentic experience. Together they form a map of competing forces that continue to exist within every generation. Not because history repeats itself in exactly the same way, but because human nature continues to wrestle with the same fundamental dilemmas. The story survives because those dilemmas survive. And perhaps that is the deepest insight of all. Human beings do not simply seek freedom. Human beings seek meaning. Sometimes freedom helps create meaning. Sometimes freedom creates uncertainty. Sometimes uncertainty creates fear. And sometimes fear creates a longing for answers that feel stronger than reality itself. The challenge is not eliminating that longing. The challenge is recognizing it when it appears. Because the desire for certainty is not inherently evil. The desire for belonging is not inherently dangerous. The desire for stability is not inherently wrong. These are deeply human impulses. The danger begins when any one of them becomes more important than the pursuit of reality. That is when the balance shifts. That is when questions become uncomfortable. That is when curiosity begins to shrink. And that is when a civilization risks losing something that may be difficult to recover. Imagine, for a moment, the final memory fragment. Not a screen. Not a slogan. Not a powerful institution. Just a single human being standing in uncertainty, resisting the temptation to surrender the search for what is real. There is something profoundly hopeful about that image. Not because it guarantees victory. Not because it promises certainty. But because it suggests that the capacity to question remains one of the most valuable qualities human beings possess. Perhaps that is the reason this story continues to matter across decades, cultures, and generations. It reminds us that reality is often complex, that truth is often uncomfortable, and that wisdom may require living with questions that never receive perfect answers. And maybe the most important question is not whether societies can preserve freedom or whether institutions can preserve truth. Maybe the deeper question is whether human beings can preserve the courage to face reality as it is, even when the comfort of a simpler illusion is always waiting to be chosen.